I never planned to stop at my daughter's house that evening. It was a whim, a father's instinct to surprise her with dinner and maybe spend an hour catching up. But as I turned the corner, my chest tightened. Parked at the gate in plain sight was a silver sedan I knew better than my own reflection. My wife's car. It was supposed to be at home, sitting quietly in our garage. Instead, it was here, and something inside me whispered that this was no coincidence. I killed the engine and sat still, my pulse refusing to settle. Slowly I stepped out, careful not to slam the door, careful not to make a sound. My shoes crunched lightly on the gravel as I approached the window, and then I heard it, voices, familiar, one warm feminine meant to soothe but now sharp and calculating, the other confident, almost smug, carrying the clipped tone of a man who knew the law too well. My wife, my son-in-law. The words struck me harder than any hammer I had ever held. Divorce, assets, strategy. A plan laid out with surgical precision, as if I were a client to be dismantled, not a husband, not a father, not the man who had built their lives brick by brick. I fumbled for my phone, hit record, and kept still. Each sentence they spoke cracked something inside me. When the talking ended, I stepped back, forced my breathing to steady, and when they finally walked out, they found me calm, polite, smiling even. I shook Dan's hand, kissed Margaret's cheek, and lied through my teeth, because now I carried something stronger than shock. I carried evidence, the first piece of a puzzle that would change everything. I sat in my car long after leaving my daughter's driveway, the phone heavy in my hand. I pressed play, and the voices filled the cabin like ghosts. For 43 minutes my wife and my son-in-law discussed my life as if it were nothing more than a ledger to be divided, a strategy to be perfected. They spoke of me not as a husband or a father, but as an obstacle in the way of their carefully designed future. Every word dragged me back through decades of memories, forcing me to question what had been real and what had been performance. Margaret's laughter once warmed me during the hardest winters, but on that recording it was sharp, metallic, the sound of calculation disguised as charm. Dan's tone carried no trace of the young man I had welcomed into our family with trust and pride. He spoke like a man assessing assets in a courtroom, not the father of the woman he had promised to cherish. I replayed certain lines, letting them echo. When the old fool finally signs the papers, the man actually believes I love him. Each sentence cracked open a memory I had held close for years. I remembered our anniversary trips, the expensive dinners, the tender words exchanged in quiet bedrooms. Had those moments been staged rehearsals for the ultimate performance? Had the hand that touched mine across the table already been writing the script of betrayal? I thought of 1995. When I built the house with my own hands, every nail, every beam, every wall meant for the family I dreamed of protecting. Margaret had stood beside me, praising my dedication, admiring the calluses that came with long days on site. Now I wondered if she had seen more than just my devotion. Maybe she saw potential, a fortune waiting to be harvested. I thought of the morning our daughter was born. Margaret was radiant, exhausted but glowing, holding Brianna with a fierceness that convinced me she had found her true calling. Yet the voice on the recording mocked that image. It belonged not to a mother but to a strategist, a woman who had used every year of marriage to study, to catalog, to prepare for the moment when the axe would fall. Listening to Dan calculate my net worth down to the decimal shook me even more. 12 million in construction. Add the vacation home. Add the investments. Nearly 20 million total. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he already owned it, as if my years of sacrifice belonged to him by right. The arrogance in his voice made my stomach twist. This was the man I had trusted with my daughter's future. This was the man who had eaten at my table, who had called me father. The recording was more than betrayal. It was evidence, but also revelation. It forced me to recognize how blind I had been. Every question Margaret had asked about contracts, every sudden interest in financial reports, every seemingly innocent conversation about company growth, it had all been reconnaissance. I had mistaken curiosity for support, but it was surveillance. She had been building a case while I was building a legacy. I pressed pause, sat in silence, and stared at the dark road ahead. I had a choice. I could let the betrayal crush me, or I could let it sharpen me. My construction career had taught me that foundations matter most, and the foundation of this marriage was gone, rotted through. The recording was not just proof of betrayal. It was the blueprint of their plan. And now it would become the blueprint of my defense. I pressed play again, not to wallow in pain, but to memorize every detail. Dates, names, documents, the way they laughed at my supposed blindness. If they thought I would walk into this trap unaware, they were wrong. The recording rewrote my marriage in 43 minutes, and it also rewrote my role in their story. I was no longer the trusting husband. I was the man who knew. I was the man preparing to fight back. The morning after I discovered the truth, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and almost did not recognize the man staring back. My eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. The urge to confront Margaret that very moment pulsed inside me like fire. But fire burns out quickly. Strategy lasts. If I went to war too early, I would lose everything. So I forced my reflection into something calm, something ordinary. The same dependable husband she thought she could manipulate. At breakfast, Margaret breezed into the kitchen dressed for work, her perfume filling the air. She kissed my cheek lightly, the way she had done thousands of times before. That morning it felt like an act performed on stage. I smiled back, cheerful, pretending not to notice the tension in her eyes. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, pouring her coffee. She nodded, talking about her schedule. But I caught the flicker of calculation in her glance. She was testing me, measuring if I suspected anything. I learned to wear my mask. I asked casual questions about her day, about errands, about who she was meeting. Each answer I stored away, checking it later against her credit card statements and phone records. She told me she had a late lunch with Linda from the club, but the receipt in my hand said otherwise. 2 glasses of wine at an upscale downtown restaurant where Linda never set foot. The mask gave me cover. The mask gave me time. The same mask accompanied me when I saw Dan at a family dinner the following weekend. He carried himself with the smug confidence of a man convinced he was the smartest person in the room. He asked about my projects, feigned interest in contract negotiations, dropped pointed questions about the value of recent bids. I answered with vague enthusiasm, pretending I did not notice how his wife, my daughter, looked confused at his sudden curiosity about her father's finances. I smiled at him, laughed at his jokes, and offered him another glass of wine. Inside, my blood simmered, but the mask never slipped. Every conversation became an opportunity. When Margaret asked about payroll, I answered patiently, making sure to provide just enough information to keep her satisfied while leaving out the real numbers. When Dan suggested we should diversify investments, I nodded thoughtfully, recording his words in my mind like evidence in a trial. Their lies became clearer with every slip of the tongue. A stray comment about deadlines that matched the timeline from the recording. A careless reference to accounts they should not have known about. Each slip confirmed that they believed I was still blind. I discovered that pretending ignorance gave me power. Margaret seemed almost relieved when I asked simple questions, as if my lack of suspicion comforted her. She grew bold, careless. Mentioning meetings she claimed were for charity work, but that I later confirmed were lunches with Dan. The more I acted like the trusting husband, the deeper they sank into their performance. They thought they were rehearsing a flawless play, but I was in the audience, memorizing every line. Some nights, when Margaret returned home later than usual, she would sigh dramatically and say she had been overwhelmed at the office. I would hand her a glass of wine and listen, nodding with sympathy, hiding the knowledge that her office lights had been off since 3 that afternoon. The mask allowed me to gather patterns, times, dates, places, all pieces of a puzzle I would soon assemble. I reminded myself daily that confrontation was the weapon they wanted me to use. If I exploded, they would paint me as unstable, paranoid, controlling. By staying calm, I stole their narrative. I let them build their case while I built mine in silence. The hardest part was my daughter. When Brianna called, cheerful and unsuspecting, I had to keep my voice steady. She deserved honesty, but I could not risk revealing my knowledge yet. Not until I had evidence strong enough to withstand the lies her husband and mother were weaving. So I asked about her work, encouraged her plans, and held back the truth burning inside me. Wearing the mask was torture, but it gave me what I needed most: time. Time to study them, time to prepare, time to turn their arrogance into their undoing. I knew eventually they would grow so confident in my blindness that they would make a mistake too big to hide. And when that moment came, I would be ready. I had always trusted Margaret with the small details of our finances. She paid household bills, organized holiday budgets, and handled the day-to-day spending that kept life running smoothly. I focused on the larger picture: contracts, payroll, property deals. Trust had been my fatal flaw. Now, armed with the recording and my mask of ignorance, I began to dismantle that trust and replace it with verification. The first evening I sat down in my office and opened the file cabinets. Decades of statements, receipts, and tax records were neatly filed, but what I wanted was hidden in the digital trail. I logged into our joint accounts, scrolling through months of transactions that I had barely noticed before. At first glance, everything looked normal: mortgage payments, utility bills, grocery stores. But as I examined closer, I saw patterns. Large withdrawals timed neatly before weekends when Margaret claimed she was visiting friends. Charges from restaurants across town where I had never set foot. Designer boutiques with receipts she never showed me. I started keeping a notebook, writing down each discrepancy with dates and amounts. 100 here, 200 there, then thousands funneled into what appeared to be a savings account I did not recognize. The beneficiary name hit me like a blow: Daniel Thompson, my son-in-law, my daughter's husband, my wife's co-conspirator. The account was structured as a joint savings, masked under a generic label, but the transfers came directly from our household account, money I had earned. Nearly $47,000 had vanished into that pool over 8 months. To Margaret, it was just another step in her long game. To me, it was evidence of betrayal that stretched beyond whispers at a window. I printed the statements, highlighting every suspicious entry. Then I cross-checked credit card bills, spa treatments that coincided with supposed charity luncheons, luxury handbags purchased during weeks she had complained about grocery costs, dinners for 2. Never 3 on nights when Brianna was out of town. Every page painted a picture I had been too blind to see. The audit became my nightly ritual. After long days at the construction site, I would come home, eat in silence, and then retreat to my office. Margaret believed I was reviewing blueprints. In reality, I was tracing the blueprints of her deception. The more I dug, the more I saw how deliberate it had been. She had maintained joint accounts to keep me comfortable while building hidden channels for herself and Dan. One evening, I noticed something even more disturbing: payments to a law firm that was not Dan's. Small retainers, disguised as consultation fees, routed from her personal card. When I called the number listed, a polite secretary answered, identifying the office as one specializing in divorce settlements. Margaret had been laying the groundwork quietly, ensuring every angle was covered. The shock no longer burned like fire. It chilled me, settled into my bones, but that coldness gave me clarity. I began cross-referencing everything: vacations, club memberships, travel expenses. I saw how Margaret had escalated her spending right after my company landed its largest municipal contract. She had treated my success not as a shared achievement, but as a new well to drain. The most painful discovery came when I reviewed old emails. Margaret had asked me for copies of business valuations under the pretense of helping organize insurance documents. I had provided them willingly, never suspecting she was stockpiling evidence for her eventual strike. Reading those messages now, I could see her manipulation in every polite request. By the end of 2 weeks, my office looked less like a home workspace and more like a crime investigation board. Statements, receipts, and highlighted notes filled the desk. Columns of numbers showed the steady bleeding of my earnings into their secret reservoir. The forensic audit had stripped away the last illusions of partnership. Yet with every discovery, I grew steadier. This was no longer about grief, it was about preparation. I now had proof that Margaret and Dan were not simply conspiring in whispers, but acting, moving money, building their escape plan with stolen bricks from the house I had built. They believed they were winning. They believed I was still blind, but the audit proved otherwise. I closed the final folder one night and leaned back, the lamp casting long shadows across the room. Betrayal was written in ink and numbers now, not just in words from a recording. They had turned my life into an equation, and they thought the solution favored them. But numbers, like buildings, can be rebuilt, reinforced, and turned against the very people who tried to manipulate them. The audit gave me direction. It revealed weaknesses in their plan and a trail I could follow. More importantly, it gave me the strength to move from defense to offense. The mask had bought me time, the audit had given me evidence. The next step would be locking down the empire they thought they had already stolen. The audit gave me the truth I had been too blind to see, but truth alone would not protect me. Margaret and Dan already believed the fortune was theirs to claim. They had studied every asset, rehearsed every legal maneuver, and calculated every dollar down to the decimal. If I did nothing, they would strike. And by the time I reacted, it would be too late. So I did what I had always done in business. I secured the foundation before the storm could tear it down. The first step was my accountant, Marcus Webb. For years he had been my quiet ally, a man who knew every figure, every contract, every subtlety of tax law. I called him under the pretense of routine planning. Sitting across from him in his office, I laid out just enough to make him understand without revealing the recording. His eyes sharpened when I asked about protective measures. "Marcus," I said, "let's say hypothetically a spouse intended to make sudden withdrawals or file claims. How do I ensure the business remains untouched?" He leaned back, thoughtful, then began outlining steps like a general mapping a battlefield. Separate personal accounts from corporate ones. Secure signatures on major withdrawals. Create emergency holds with the bank that could freeze access instantly. I left his office with a folder of documents and a plan that would change the game. That evening I drove to First National Bank where Tom Bradley, the president, greeted me like an old friend. Tom had been my golf partner for 15 years, a man who trusted my word as I trusted his discretion. Over coffee in his mahogany-lined conference room, I explained I needed a comprehensive review of every joint account, every credit line, every automatic payment system. Tom raised an eyebrow but did not ask why. He had seen enough men in our community blindsided by betrayal to know what I was preparing for. Within hours, the process began. Every account that bore Margaret's name was placed under security review. From that moment forward, any transaction required identity verification in person, with photo ID and secondary documentation. Credit lines were suspended, joint cards disabled, automatic transfers halted. Margaret would not know until the first decline at a country club lunch or a boutique checkout. By then it would be too late. The locks would already be in place. I drove home that night with a strange calm settling over me. For weeks I had felt like prey, hiding behind masks, gathering scraps of evidence while Margaret and Dan moved boldly. But now I felt the shift. The hunter had learned patience, but he had also learned to set traps. The next morning, Margaret tried to pay for groceries and called me in a flurry of frustration. Her card had been declined, the bank unhelpful, the embarrassment unbearable. I listened with practiced innocence, promising to look into it. In truth, I knew every decline, every frozen account, was another reminder that I was not as blind as she believed. Dan's reaction reached me through my investigator. He had tried to withdraw funds from the joint account and failed. He had tried again through what appeared to be a trust for Brianna, only to find that access locked as well. His temper had boiled over into angry phone calls with bank clerks, threats of legal action, demands to speak with management. Each outburst was another thread unraveling from his carefully crafted lawyer's mask. By the end of that week, Margaret's access to wealth had shrunk to whatever cash sat in her purse. Dan's leverage had evaporated, leaving him desperate. The beauty of the move was that it was entirely legal. A husband securing marital assets during estate planning. A businessman safeguarding accounts in turbulent times. Nothing illegal, nothing even questionable, just prudence and protection. But for Margaret and Dan, it was the first tremor before the collapse. They had believed they could plan in shadows, moving pieces without my knowledge. Now they would learn that every fortress has gates, and I had locked mine. The vaults were sealed, the accounts secure, and their hands suddenly empty. For the first time since the betrayal, I slept soundly. The locks were in place, the empire protected. They thought they were closing in on their victory. What they did not know was that the game had already shifted, and I was no longer the man they imagined. Grief is a strange companion. At first it burns, then it hollows, and finally it hardens into something cold and sharp. In the first days after I discovered Margaret's betrayal, I felt as though the air itself had been stolen from my lungs. I walked through the house we had built together and saw only ghosts of lies. Every photograph, every anniversary card. Every carefully chosen decoration felt like a stage prop in a performance that had lasted 25 years. I could not sleep without hearing her voice from that recording, mocking me plotting with Dan, but grief alone would not save me. I had lived my life as a builder, and builders do not abandon structures when cracks appear. They study the damage, shore up the foundations, and design a plan. One evening, after Margaret left for another invented dinner, I locked my office door and transformed it into something new. No longer a place for reviewing contracts or blueprints, it became a war room. I cleared the shelves, laid out notebooks, taped timelines to the wall. On one side I listed every account, property, and investment. On another I wrote out dates and suspicious transactions. In the center I drew a map of names: Margaret, Dan, their contacts, their lawyers. Beneath each name I wrote weaknesses, leverage points, vulnerabilities. It looked less like a marriage and more like a battlefield with front lines and supply chains. The process gave me clarity. I could see how Margaret's behavior had shifted around major milestones. After my largest municipal contract, her spending increased dramatically. After Brianna's wedding, her interest in legal documents grew. Each moment in our family story aligned perfectly with their strategy. What I had once dismissed as quirks of personality now revealed themselves as tactical maneuvers. I called Marcus again, my accountant, and this time I dropped the pretense. I told him directly that Margaret and Dan were conspiring to strip me of assets. He listened without surprise. In his profession, betrayal was as common as taxes. Then you must build layers, he said, not just walls but traps. Protect what they know, conceal what they do not, and keep your evidence close. Together we began drafting a structure that separated my company's assets from marital accounts. Next I called Sarah Chen, my longtime forensic accountant. A woman whose skill with numbers rivaled any litigator with words. I trusted her judgment because she had no ties to Margaret or Dan. She understood the stakes instantly. Alan, they will try to reframe everything. Generosity becomes control, protection becomes abuse. If you want to fight this, you need more than numbers. You need patterns that reveal intent. She asked me to gather communications, notes, even casual texts that showed how Margaret had positioned herself. I agreed, already pulling out folders. By the end of the week, my war room looked like the command center of a campaign. 2 laptops displayed side by side, one for financials, one for legal research. Yellow pads covered the desk, filled with my handwriting. I categorized columns as assets, weaknesses, timeline, leverage. When I walked into the room each morning, I no longer felt like a betrayed husband. I felt like a general. The transformation was not instant. Grief still came in waves. Sometimes I would pick up our anniversary card from last December, the one where she had written about another 25 years together, and rage would choke me. But then I would pin that card on the wall under the word performance. It became evidence, proof that her declarations of love were tools of manipulation. Each time grief surfaced, I converted it into strategy. Each tear became ink on my notes, each pang of loss another weapon sharpened. The hardest part was keeping the mask in place outside that room. At family dinners, I smiled and asked about Brianna's work. When Margaret called to complain about the frozen accounts, I offered sympathy and promised to speak with the bank. At the club, I laughed with colleagues as if nothing were wrong. But inside, every moment fed my strategy. Every word she spoke gave me another detail to add to the board. In construction, I had learned that a strong foundation makes the difference between collapse and survival. In war, I now understood that strategy makes the difference between defeat and victory. My grief had been real, but grief could not protect my daughter, my company, or the life I had built. Strategy could. And so I built it brick by brick, line by line, until the war room no longer smelled of sorrow but of determination. They thought they had mapped the game. They believed they held every piece, that I was still wandering blind, but I had rebuilt myself in silence. And soon they would discover that the man they thought they could destroy was already preparing their downfall. The war room gave me control, but battles are not won alone. I had convinced myself that this was my fight and mine alone, a private war against betrayal that no one else could carry. But then the phone rang, and my daughter's voice changed everything. It was late in the evening when Brianna called. I was still at my desk, surrounded by papers and maps of treachery, when her name flashed on the screen. I forced my tone into something casual. "Hey, sweetheart, how's your day?" There was a pause, a hesitation that told me she was choosing her words carefully. "Dad," she said, "is everything okay between you and Mom lately?" The question cut deeper than any blade. My instinct was to protect her, to shield her from the truth. But I could not ignore the seriousness in her tone. I asked what made her wonder. She explained that Mom seemed tense, distracted, and that Dan had been asking unusual questions about the structure of my company. He keeps bringing up things that don't make sense, she said, like who controls which assets, how contracts are divided. It feels like he's fishing for something. I sat in silence, gripping the phone tighter, realizing that my daughter unknowingly had become another piece in their strategy. Margaret and Dan were using her as a source of information, disguising their manipulation as casual conversation. And Brianna, with her training in psychology, sensed the trap even if she did not understand its full scope. I could hear the conflict in her voice. She wanted to trust her husband, wanted to believe her mother, but her instincts told her something was wrong. "Dad, if something was going on, you'd tell me, right?" The question weighed heavily on me. How could I tell her that her own husband and mother were conspiring against me, against everything I had built? How could I place that burden on her shoulders without destroying her world? I chose caution. "Of course, sweetheart," I said gently, "but everything's fine, just the usual business pressures." She didn't sound convinced. The silence that followed was filled with all the things I could not yet say. When we ended the call, I sat for a long time staring at the note spread across my desk. My grief deepened knowing she had already been pulled into their web, yet at the same time her suspicion became a weapon I had not expected. If Brianna could sense their deception, then Margaret and Dan's performance was already cracking. The next day I began paying closer attention to how they interacted with her. I watched Margaret slip questions into casual conversations, fishing for details about company finances under the guise of concern for her daughter's future. I noticed how Dan framed hypothetical legal scenarios, asking what Brianna thought about controlling parents or financial dependency in marriages. They were testing her, shaping narratives, preparing her to view me as the villain in their story. But what they underestimated was her training. She was not a naive young woman anymore. She was a professional psychologist. She recognized manipulation, even if she did not yet realize how close it struck. I saw the doubt in her eyes when Dan pressed too hard. I saw her hesitation when Margaret exaggerated stories. She was beginning to notice the cracks. For the first time, I felt less alone. I could not reveal everything to her yet, but I knew I had an ally forming, an ally born not from my persuasion, but from her own intelligence and integrity. That gave me hope that when the truth finally came out, she would see through the lies. That night, I returned to my war room with renewed determination. On the wall, beneath Margaret's name and Dan's name, I added another card, Brianna, not as an enemy, not as a pawn, but as an ally I had not expected. Someone whose instincts would protect her from being used as a weapon against me. Someone who might ultimately tip the balance in my favor. They thought they had secured every angle, but they had overlooked the power of a daughter who could see patterns of manipulation for what they were. They had underestimated her, just as they had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost them everything. By the time I locked the accounts and fortified the company, I had moved from defense to offense. I knew Margaret and Dan expected me to stumble, to rage blindly, to reveal myself too soon. Instead, I chose patience. Pressure, applied carefully, reveals weaknesses, and I was determined to make them show me every crack in their facade. The first sign came at the country club. Margaret called me in a hushed panic when her card was declined during lunch with her friends. Her voice shook not from financial loss but from humiliation. In her world, status was oxygen, and the embarrassment of being unable to pay for a meal in front of her peers left her gasping. I offered sympathy, promising to speak with the bank, while inside I noted how quickly her confidence wavered. The woman who had plotted for months now sounded like a child caught without permission. Dan's reaction was louder. My investigator reported that he stormed into his office after failed withdrawal attempts, slamming doors and barking orders at his secretary. He made angry phone calls to the bank, threatening lawsuits and demanding immediate access. His composure cracked, revealing the arrogance beneath the polished lawyer's tone. Every word he shouted was another thread in the rope tightening around him. I continued to wear my mask. At home, I asked Margaret if everything was all right, pretending concern. She muttered excuses, claiming it must be a bank error, but her eyes darted nervously, searching for signs that I knew more. I offered to make dinner, pouring her a glass of wine, and watched as she drank quickly, her composure slipping. She believed she was still in control, but her fear betrayed her. The more the pressure mounted, the more mistakes they made. Margaret began covering her tracks poorly, scribbling vague explanations on receipts, leaving messages unanswered, and forgetting the lies she had told. Dan grew more reckless, meeting with Margaret in public places where they were easily observed. My investigator captured photographs, their body language intimate and careless, the kind of evidence that would shatter their credibility in any courtroom. I noticed something else too. Margaret's tone with me softened, as if she were trying to rebuild the image of a devoted wife. She asked about my day, prepared meals she had long since abandoned making, even suggested we take a weekend trip together. To anyone else it might have looked like affection, but I heard the fear in her voice. She was trying to gauge how much I knew. The mask convinced her I remained blind, and that illusion was my greatest weapon. Every decline, every blocked account, every unanswered phone call from the bank added to their anxiety. They had believed themselves untouchable, architects of a flawless plan. Now they were scrambling, unsure whether the fortress they thought they were storming had walls far higher than they imagined. I remember one evening in particular. Margaret returned from a supposed charity meeting, tense and distracted. I casually mentioned that Tom Bradley, the bank president, had called me to discuss account security measures. Her fork froze halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide for a fraction of a second before she forced a smile. "That's good, dear," she said. Safety is important, but her voice betrayed her, the words clipped, unnatural. In that moment I knew she was unraveling. Pressure exposes character. It had taken me decades to learn that in business, and now I watched it unfold in my own home. Margaret and Dan were not partners building a future together. They were conspirators bound by greed and arrogance, and when pressed, they turned on each other. I overheard their sharp exchanges when they thought I was out of earshot. Dan scolding her for carelessness, Margaret accusing him of poor planning. They believed the cracks were hidden. I made sure to notice everyone. As the pressure grew, so did my calm. I no longer felt like prey. I was the one setting the stage, tightening the screws, and recording every stumble. They thought they were driving me toward collapse. In reality, I was guiding them toward their own. The mask, the audit, and the locks had prepared me for this moment. Now, with every misstep they made, I gathered evidence not only of betrayal, but of their unraveling. Soon, I would not need to wear the mask at all. Soon, the truth would stand on its own. In my line of work, reputation was currency. Contracts were signed not only because of numbers, but because of trust built over decades. I knew that Margaret and Dan wanted to use that very reputation against me. They were planning to paint me as controlling, abusive, the kind of man who manipulated money and family alike. If they could stain my name, then everything else, my company, my relationships, my standing in the community, would follow. That was their plan. What they did not anticipate was that I understood the game better than they did. Community is a small town's heartbeat. People talk. Rumors spread faster than facts, but once truth anchors itself, it can weather storms. I began to shape the conversation before Margaret and Dan had a chance. Quietly, carefully, I met with those who mattered most. Over lunch with Tom Bradley, the bank president, I mentioned difficulties at home with the same tone I would use to describe weather delays on a project. I gave no details, only enough to plant the seed that I was protecting myself from sudden financial upheaval. Tom nodded, his sympathy genuine, and I knew that when Margaret inevitably called him in frustration, his perception would already lie in my favor. Next came the Chamber of Commerce, at a board meeting. When someone asked casually about Margaret's absence from a fundraising event, I sighed and said, "Sometimes people aren't who you thought they were." I let the disappointment color my words but did not elaborate. Silence can speak louder than explanations. By the end of the evening, I noticed the looks exchanged between colleagues. They were drawing their own conclusions, conclusions I allowed but never stated. The country club was Margaret's kingdom. For years she had thrived there, weaving herself into social circles, flaunting the lifestyle my work had provided. Now, with her cards declined and her composure cracking, she was vulnerable. I did not need to confront her there, I only needed to let her unravel. Each time she appeared flustered or made excuses about finances, the whispers grew louder. Her friends turned distant, some even cold, as if sensing a shift in power. Reputation chess is not won by striking pieces from the board, but by positioning them until your opponent has no moves left. Dan's professional world was even easier to influence. Lawyers live and die by their credibility. I did not spread rumors, but I made sure that conversations about his debt, his shortcuts, and his arrogance reached the right ears. Contractors who had once tolerated his delays suddenly began speaking out. Businessmen who had heard whispers of impropriety now shared their concerns openly. I did not need to invent a narrative, I only needed to reveal the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. At home, Margaret grew more restless as her social calendar shrank. Invitations she once received weekly stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. Friends who had once competed for her attention now avoided her gaze. She blamed me, of course, convinced I was pulling strings. Never realizing that her own arrogance had done most of the work. The beauty of this strategy was that I remained calm, polite, even gracious. When asked about Margaret, I never spoke ill. I simply said we were going through a difficult time and that I hoped for the best. That restraint only deepened the contrast when Margaret's bitterness surfaced. Where I appeared composed, she appeared desperate. Where I seemed dignified, she seemed unraveling. Reputation is fragile, but when handled carefully, it can be a shield as much as a sword. By the time Margaret and Dan realized what was happening, their narrative had already begun to collapse. Margaret could no longer lean on her friends for validation. Dan could no longer command unquestioned respect in his profession. And me, I remained steady, the man who had built not only homes but trust. The community chessboard was shifting. Piece by piece, they lost control. Margaret was left isolated in the very circles she had once dominated. Dan was whispered about in professional gatherings where reputation meant survival. They had believed they could destroy me by tearing down my name. Instead, they found their own reputations rotting away, one move at a time. The more I studied Margaret and Dan, the clearer their next move became. They would not rely on financial theft alone. They needed a story, a performance convincing enough to turn sympathy in their favor. And I knew exactly which story they would choose. They would paint me as an abusive husband, not with fists or shouting, but with money. They would claim I had controlled Margaret by restricting accounts, monitoring spending, and creating dependency. It was a clever plan because the truth of the locked accounts could be twisted to fit their script. I refused to wait for them to launch the attack. If they wanted to frame me, I would preempt them. In war, the one who controls the narrative controls the battlefield. So I began building my case piece by piece. Not just to defend myself, but to expose their manipulation. I started with messages. Over the years, Margaret had left a trail of texts thanking me for gifts, vacations, even the smallest gestures. "You always take such good care of us. I can't believe how lucky I am to have a husband like you." I archived every one of them dating back years, evidence that generosity had been her reality until it suited her to call it abuse. I paired these with receipts showing luxury items she had purchased freely, handbags, jewelry, spa treatments. Each one contradicted the claim of control. Phone records were next. I traced late-night calls between her and Dan, logged patterns that aligned with suspicious transactions. Margaret claimed to be attending book clubs or charity meetings, yet her phone connected repeatedly to Dan's office line or his personal cell. Those records would prove coordination, not fear. A woman under financial intimidation does not conspire in secret with her son-in-law. She does not laugh on recordings about bleeding her husband dry. Then came spending evidence. I compiled statements showing how Margaret had full access to every account for decades, moving money at will, traveling where she pleased, making purchases without question. The pattern was clear. She enjoyed complete financial freedom until the day I discovered her betrayal. Only then, when I froze the accounts to protect what was left, did she claim abuse. The sequence told the story better than any courtroom speech could. I also documented my own restraint. In 35 years, I had never once closed an account in her name, never once required permission for her spending, never once denied her a luxury she demanded. I had bought her cars, vacations, memberships, even homes, all at her request. The paper trail showed not control but indulgence. If she tried to twist that generosity into oppression, the documents would unravel her claims. To strengthen the case, I prepared character testimony. Friends and colleagues who had witnessed our marriage could attest to Margaret's constant demands, her pride in the lifestyle I had provided, and my willingness to give. These were not bitter ex-friends, but respected members of the community whose words carried weight. Their voices would contrast sharply with Margaret's sudden reinvention as a victim. Every night I pinned new evidence to the war room wall, the narrative taking shape before my eyes. Margaret and Dan believed they were authors writing my downfall. In reality, they were characters in a story I was already drafting. They had provided the script in their own words, their own lies, their own greed. All I had to do was arrange it so the truth revealed itself. I imagined the day they would stand in court, Margaret with her rehearsed tears, Dan with his legal arguments polished smooth. They would claim intimidation, financial abuse, manipulation. And then my attorney would stand, calm and steady, and play the recording. He would present the texts, the receipts, the phone logs. Piece by piece, their story would crumble, replaced by the undeniable evidence of conspiracy. Preempting their narrative was more than defense, it was offense. It was taking control of the battlefield before the enemy even arrived. By the time they accused me of abuse, the proof of their deception would already be waiting. And when the curtain finally rose, they would not be the authors of the story. I would. By the time I finished assembling the evidence. My war room looked more like a prosecutor's office than a businessman's home. The walls were covered with charts, timelines, highlighted receipts, and transcripts. I had moved past grief long ago. Now I lived in the cold clarity of preparation. Margaret and Dan thought they were building a perfect case, but in truth they were digging their own graves. My task was simple: carry everything I had gathered into the courtroom and let the truth speak louder than their lies. The first step was choosing the right attorney. I did not want theatrics or bravado. I wanted calm precision, the kind of lawyer who dismantled opponents with patience. James Morrison had been in practice for 30 years, a man whose reputation was built on quiet competence. When I laid out my evidence on his desk, he listened without interruption. He played the recording twice, expression steady, only nodding when Margaret's laughter rang through the speakers. When it ended, he leaned back and said, "We don't just have a defense, we have a case." Together we built the strategy. He would not open with accusations. He would let Margaret and Dan present their story first, let them feel confident, let them act out their performance of fear and victimhood. Only then would he bring out the evidence piece by piece, cutting their lies apart until nothing remained. "Surprise is the sharpest blade," he told me. I agreed. We organized everything into exhibits. Exhibit A, the full audio recording of their conspiracy, complete with timestamps and authentication. Exhibit B, financial statements showing unauthorized transfers into the joint account with Dan. Exhibit C, receipts of Margaret's luxury spending, contrasted against her claims of restricted finances. Exhibit D, text messages expressing gratitude and love during the very years she would later describe as oppressive. Exhibit E, phone records linking her late-night calls to Dan's office and cell phone. And finally, Exhibit F, witness testimony from respected members of the community who had seen firsthand the freedom and indulgence Margaret enjoyed. Each exhibit was a nail in the coffin of their narrative. Alone, any piece might be explained away. Together, they formed a chain impossible to break. And the recording was the anchor, their own voices mocking me, plotting and revealing intent that no jury or judge could ignore. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, I kept the mask on in public. Margaret continued her act, speaking of headaches, inventing meetings, and playing the role of an overwhelmed wife. Dan carried himself with confidence, convinced his legal skills would dominate. They believed the accounts were still frozen by accident, that my composure meant ignorance. They had no idea that every day brought me closer to the courtroom where their scheme would collapse. The night before the hearing, I sat alone in my office. I replayed the recording one last time, not out of doubt, but as a reminder of why I fought. 25 years of marriage, every sacrifice I had made, every ounce of trust I had given, reduced to their cruel laughter. The pain still stung, but it was no longer a wound, it was fuel. Tomorrow that recording would not haunt me, tomorrow it would condemn them. When I arrived at court, I felt an unexpected calm. The building stood solid against the morning sky, much like the projects I had built throughout my career. Inside, Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, carefully dressed in muted colors, her demeanor crafted to appear fragile. Dan sat beside her, whispering strategy with the same smug confidence I had once mistaken for charm. I took my seat with James, steady and silent. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, I watched Margaret swear to tell the truth. She spoke of fear, of control, of financial abuse. Her voice trembled at the right moments, her eyes filled with rehearsed tears. Dan followed with carefully chosen legal terms, painting me as a manipulative tyrant. For a moment, anyone listening might have believed them. Then James stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture wildly. He simply requested permission to present evidence. One by one, the exhibits came forth. The audio filled the courtroom, Margaret's laughter slicing through her own lies. The financial records revealed theft, the texts revealed gratitude, the receipts revealed indulgence, the phone logs revealed conspiracy. The performance crumbled in real time. By the time James finished, the silence in the room was heavier than any verdict. Margaret sat pale, Dan furious, the mask torn from both of them. The judge leaned forward, expression cold. The battle I had prepared for was over before it had even truly begun. I had not just defended myself. I had turned their own weapons against them. The courtroom was no longer their stage. It was mine. The courtroom felt colder once the lies had been stripped bare. Margaret sat silent, her lawyer gone, her performance exposed for what it was. Dan's composure shattered into rage he could not disguise. The judge dismissed their petition with prejudice, her words final and unshakable. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift from my chest. The recording, the receipts, the texts, each piece of evidence had not only protected me, but revealed their scheme in the clearest light. Brianna was there, standing taller than I had ever seen her. She chose truth over loyalty, conviction over comfort. Her voice did not waver when she said she could no longer stand beside a husband who conspired against her father or a mother who weaponized her own child. Watching her step forward on her own terms filled me with pride I cannot put into words. When it was over, I signed the papers ending 25 years of marriage. I walked out not as a broken man, but as one who had defended everything he built. My company remained intact, my name steady in the community, my dignity unscarred. Margaret had gambled everything on performance, and performance only lasts until the lights come on. Driving home that evening, rain dotted the windshield in soft rhythms. The house waited, quieter than it had ever been, yet honest for the first time in years. I sat behind the wheel, calm, knowing I was free. Love, I realized, is true or it is nothing. Pretending can last a lifetime, but it cannot survive the truth. And as the storm cleared, I was ready to write the next chapter in my own voice.